Alrighty. Hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Lana Carlip, and I am Vice President of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable non-governmental organization dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. Most Canadians don't have to give a second thought about their peace and security. The NATO Association aims to remind our listeners of just that and how this is possible through Canada's collaborative alliance dedicated to maintaining mutual defense and peace. As part of Canada's contributions to maintaining peace, we connect and work with our allies, and today our focus is on Canada and New Zealand relations. Leading us through the discussion will be Eric Jackson and Adwit Sharma, two exceptional key members of our team at the NATO Association of Canada. Following some of their prepared questions, we will be opening the floor to questions from our live YouTube audience. So if you're watching, please pose your questions as they arise in the chat window. Before I pass it off to Eric and Adwit, I should remind you all to subscribe to our NATO Canada YouTube channel and to join our membership in supporting Canada's role in NATO and the rules-based international order. And with that, Eric and Adwit, it's off to you.
Thank you so much, Lana. And hello, everyone. Welcome to our series of events discussing diplomatic relations between Canada and our allies around the world. My name is Eric Jackson. I am the program editor for Canada's NATO, as well as the ambassador coordinator for this diplomatic speaking series. We are a non-for-profit organization that supports and promotes Canada's international relations and diplomatic relations all around the world.
And my name is Adwit Sharma, and I also am a program editor for the Trade and Economy Program and an ambassador coordinator at the NATO Association of Canada.
We are honored to be joined today by His Excellency Martin Harvey, the High Commissioner of New Zealand to Canada. High Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleased to be here.
Excellent. Now, before we get into the High Commissioner's opening remarks, I'd like to briefly go over his bio so that our audience members know exactly who the High Commissioner is, and that will sort of frame our discussion for today. So, Mr. Martin Harvey took up his role as High Commissioner of New Zealand in Canada on January 17th, 2020. Previously, he was Chief Negotiator in the Trade and Economic Group of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, responsible for the New Zealand's free trade agreement negotiations with the European Union. Mr. Harvey joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1984 and has served in Canberra, in Geneva as New Zealand Deputy Permanent Representative to the World Trade Organization and as New Zealand High Commissioner to Singapore. Mr. Harvey has also enjoyed a number of other assignments during his career, including his work on climate change issues in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet from 2001 to 2002, and New Zealand's ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. Martin Harvey was a New Zealand United World College scholar, attended Lester B. Pearson College of the Pacific in British Columbia, Canada. He is also a graduate of Massey University in Palmerston North, where he completed a Bachelor in Business Studies, and the University of Auckland gained a Master in Philosophy and Economics. After that wonderful introduction, High Commissioner, I invite you to begin with your opening remarks, and we can go from there.
Well, good day to everybody. Bonjour à toutes et tous. As we say in New Zealand, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks very much to everyone for the opportunity to talk to the NATO Association today. It's a perfect opportunity for me to talk to a group of engaged Canadians, a little about New Zealand's international efforts, especially when our efforts in Canada have been a little constrained by COVID-19 over the past year, basically since the time I got here to Canada. So in my introduction, I'd like to cover briefly New Zealand's role and interests in Canada, what in effect our High Commission here focuses on. I'd like to explain our relationship with NATO and its members, our participation and aspirations with that organisation. Speak about New Zealand's foreign policy goals and our focus on the Indo-Pacific region, some of the key challenges that we're facing and responding to there, and the importance of our Transpacific relationships through some of our key work in the institutions and other fora in the region. So Canada is one of New Zealand's oldest and most trusted partners. Our relationship I describe as very warm, it's very active, and it's very fruitful. As countries, I think we have a lot of history, a lot of shared history, a lot of shared experience, that continues to inform the way we interact and cooperate today. So if you look across the broad reach of political security and trade and economic cooperation, there are few more like-minded countries than New Zealand, than Canada. So I was just reading the other day about our recent activities in the UN Human Rights Council, and the level of cooperation between New Zealand and Canada in that forum really stood out for me. The importance of our relationship is particularly apparent in the multilateral sphere, such as I've just mentioned, but also because of our Five Eyes partnership and connections. There's a closeness and there's an ease of doing business between us, which it's our job here in the High Commission to promote and nurture. We have a very conducive environment for doing that right now in our current political configurations, just because of the respective policy orientations of our two governments. Indeed, in recent years, there's been a heightened interest in domestic policy and a lot of sharing of information between us. We've been very keen to learn from Canada in areas like criminal justice reform, housing policy, assisted dying legislation, and marijuana law reform, although that didn't pass in New Zealand. It failed a referendum. Because of the comprehensive and progressive partnership known as CPTPP, we now have a free trade agreement with us. And this agreement has helped us to develop further our trade and investment ties. We're working with Canada as one of the partners in CPTPP to make sure that it's well implemented. And we're now working with Canada and others to try and extend it outward to new partners like the UK. On the international front, the range of shared challenges for countries like Canada and New Zealand has increased. Don't need to mention issues like escalating geostrategic rivalries, challenges to the rules-based order, and the global threat of climate change. In all of these areas, our exchanges and cooperation are a constant and growing feature of our relationship. COVID-19 has underlined the benefits of these conversations that we have. We've talked a lot about, the initial response, how we were protecting our citizens, how we were protecting our economies, now how we're growing back, building back better, and also how we open our borders in a safe way, so that we can, reconnect with the rest of the world. So if we're defining our mission here in Canada at the High Commission, we're finding new opportunities to extend these connections with Canada at all levels. We're developing our trade and economic relationships by promoting the benefits of our free trade agreement. We're promoting our engagement in the defence and security area, so that we can, enhance both our abilities to shape and respond to developments that affect us. We're encouraging and facilitating our cooperation on a range of global issues. Probably the most important one that, in that regard, is climate change and our respective policy responses to that. And of particular interest and also personal importance to me is our cooperation around Indigenous issues. I guess there'll be no surprises to anybody listening how important and useful that might be in a bilateral context where we're both, trying to reshape our countries in a way that is inclusive of all people, but in particular, those Indigenous people have been affected by colonial policies in the past and still suffer from discrimination and exclusion. I'd like to touch on Canada's key membership of NATO, New Zealand's partnership with that organisation, which is also an important element of our cooperation with Canada in the security space. We're called a partner across the globe with NATO, and we enjoy a special status as one of only 7 non-NATO nations. This relationship is based on cooperation in a range of areas, such as as participating or supporting NATO missions, contributing to the development of NATO standards and our ability to operate in NATO operations, and of course a range of strategic dialogue and exchange of views on defence and security issues. We've had a lot of alignment recently in women, peace and security, which has been a significant focus of NATO in past years. And our cooperation with NATO has only become more important as the challenges that New Zealand faces become more global in their impacts and more transnational in the way that they're delivered. So we've increased the tempo of our political dialogue with NATO in recent times. And through that cooperation, I think we can say that New Zealand is seen as a reliable and constructive partner for NATO. A little about the Indo-Pacific. We recognise that our home is an increasingly contested region. As our PM recently noted, we always have been and need to be a country that looks outward. And so we've embraced the concept of an Indo-Pacific as our wider home, locating New Zealand in this larger grouping of nations and regions that encompasses East Asia, the Pacific, the Indian subcontinent, and the Pacific Rim. And this region, of course, is very dynamic. It's 60% of the world's population. It's very simple, central to our interests. And as our Prime Minister has also said, we may be far from others, but we're not, and we never have been isolated from the impacts of global politics. And we can't understate the environmental, health, geopolitical difficulties that we face. And it's a given, we take it as a given for New Zealand that regional and global cooperation is the only way that we can address these. We're first and foremost, we're in the Indo-Pacific, but we're first and foremost a Pacific nation. 15% of our population is Maori, another close to 10% are Pacific Islands people. We have a very strong Pacific identity. And we have an enduring interest in working with our Pacific neighbours, some of whom we have a constitutional responsibility for. We have a responsibility to support the regional architecture and encourage what we could call Pacific-owned solutions to problems. We want our engagement with the Pacific to be, as much as possible, partner-led, and this will really matter in the future. Each of these countries has to chart their own development pathway, and over time, we are trying to integrate this partnership approach into our overall overseas development assistance framework. What are some of the things we're doing to respond in the Pacific in our region right now? Obviously, as I suggested, lifting our engagement with the Pacific region, in particular to protect them from COVID, and we're pleased that some parts of the Pacific remain COVID-free. Although the economic impacts of the pandemic on this region is severe. On vaccines, we're supporting the rollout to the Indo-Pacific region. We were a very early mover on the COVAX facility. And we have a range of ODA engagement at the moment with the wider Indo-Pacific region that's helping to support those countries through the pandemic. And this comes on top of the $300 million we've committed to climate change-related development globally and in the Pacific. Looking a little beyond the immediate Pacific, supporting ASEAN centrality is a key for the success of our regional cooperation. For New Zealand, ASEAN is the convening body for regional diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific region. We have a seat at the region's top table for strategic discussions in the form of the East Asian Summit. And for decades, we have pursued economic opportunities and diversified trading relationships with the countries of the region. And for us, the Indo-Pacific has to be a region of free and open trade. During the pandemic, we've doubled down on our efforts to keeping markets and supply chains open when the tendency for governments has been to put up barriers and become more self-sufficient. We worked with partners like Canada, Australia, Singapore to support regional supply chains. joined in ministerial statements and the like, and many of you will be familiar with these. Another constant focus of New Zealand is protecting the multilateral trading system at a time when it's under stress. And despite the problems of the system, problems in the WTO of reaching broader agreement on so many issues, keeping countries to their WTO commitments, has been really important during the pandemic. And here we commend the work of Canada and the Ottawa Group, which we've been a very active and supporting member of. And global rules, of course, can be bolstered by rules in the region. And here again, I'll mention CPTPP as our highest quality free trade agreement, and one that Canada and New Zealand work together closely on. Finally, just a word about APEC this year. New Zealand is a host of APEC 2021. We're doing it entirely virtually due to COVID. And this has highlighted some of the advantages of COVID diplomacy. That is, we've been able to use these virtual processes to bring people together quickly and perhaps a little more cheaply, without the time that's required for countries to travel. And it's worked largely pretty well through the process, although it becomes more and more challenging as you start to trying to reach agreement on statements and programs, as you're unable to benefit from the closer personal relationships, the smaller conversations that necessarily take place around large meetings. But we think we've had a certain amount of success. 2 weeks ago, our Prime Minister hosted the first ever extraordinary meeting of APEC leaders to discuss how to get the region going through the health crisis and accelerate economic recovery. We're actively promoting in APEC work to develop a new pandemic treaty globally to improve global surveillance and early responses to any future pandemics. And of course, to strengthen the World Health Organization. And we've been working with our APEC partners to ensure that our responses to COVID-19 in areas like trade and economic recovery are all pulling in the same direction. And in particular, we want the recovery to be a sustainable and equitable one. So harnessing digital technologies, decarbonizing our economies, and ensuring the inclusiveness of economic recovery. And these are themes that resonate very, very well here in Canada as well as in New Zealand. So kia ora, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for your wonderful opening remarks. I think you've wonderfully touched upon quite a bit of the stuff we're going to be talking about as we move into our moderated section for the next 20 minutes. Before we open the floor to questions from our live audience. And once again, I implore all of you watching live to please send your questions in the chat so we can try and get to as many as we can. And with that, I have our first question here. So New Zealand and Canada have long enjoyed a close relationship forged by a shared history and similar values. And as you mentioned, this is complemented by like-minded thinking in international institutions like the UNHCR. And you also touched upon the Indo-Pacific, which we here in Canada often forget we are a part of as well. In this regard, High Commissioner, do you believe there is scope for cooperation between New Zealand and Canada in forming a united strategy for the Indo-Pacific? And if so, what does that look like to you?
I think a constant theme of New Zealand's engagement with Canada in recent times has been around the Indo-Pacific and Canada's engagement. And I think Canada, of course, in recent years has deliberately tried to shift and broaden its focus. It obviously has a north-south focus, given that's the importance of the Arctic and countries to the south, and very deep and important transatlantic ties. But increasingly, the rise of the Indo-Pacific region and the challenges we see there has meant that Canada has had to put a lot more effort into managing those relationships. And New Zealand has supported, has tried to be as it's supportive of Canada in that region. I mean, I think we've been more advanced in our engagement with being a little closer to East Asia. We've been more advanced in terms of our engagement with the regional architecture, but we've sought to support Canada's engagement with that. We provide advice from time to time on various forums, we've tried to work as closely with Canada in the forums of which we're a part, such as the CPTPP, for example, and some of our engagement in the security and defence architecture. In some ways, Canada and New Zealand have the sort of relationship where we carry on a dialogue informally almost constantly. It's not as if we need, detailed institutions to carry that forward, because Canada is a default option for us when we think, who do we need to talk about to take forward any particular initiatives? I think personally, my personal view as High Commissioner, there could be a little more structure so that we make sure that we're always engaged at the right level at the right time. I think the relationships that we have put us in pretty good stead to really help each other in all of these issues that we face. The challenges of climate change in the Pacific, for example, the challenges of strategic rivalry between countries. You name the issue there. Canada and New Zealand have a level of cooperation on it.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. And it is really evident that Canada and New Zealand have deep strategic and cooperative ties. And one key facet of that is our strong economic relationship, represented in almost 1.2 or over 1.2, in exchange goods in 2020 alone. And a secure and efficient flow of goods and services between our two countries is vital for our cooperation relationship. What would you say is the impact of COVID-19 on these trade relationships? And what do you think can be done in the future to manage such shocks that sort of COVID-19 presents?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think our trade and economic relationship is one where we've seen quite an important growth in two-way trade, goods and services investment in recent years, and this was actually bolstered by the timing of the CPTPP. We've got two-way trade of about $2 billion. We've got wealthy consumer markets. We each supply the kinds of goods to each other's markets, which there's high demand. We've taken advantage of the opportunity of investment from Canada over the past 5 years. We've seen this in a range of industries like agri-food. We've seen it in forestry, healthcare, digital technology. And throughout the pandemic, surprisingly, this trade and economic growth has kept up. A few products have been affected. Others, in fact, have sort of strengthened their presence in the market. Those companies working both ways that are digitally enabled have enjoyed quite a lot of success. Food products going both ways have held up quite a lot. That's of course been something of a feature, that the distribution and the way they're retailed and sold has changed, but the demand for the products has held up. And so what can we do in future? First thing, I think, as I mentioned, we have to look at how we can open up our borders again to one another. And both countries are going to do this in a careful way. New Zealand's in a unique situation of having to shift from a situation of COVID being suppressed and eliminated from community transmission to a situation where we're going to be accepting more risk of COVID coming back in, but hopefully with a vaccinated population and other health measures in place. the tourist travel, the air travel, and the freight facilitation between our countries needs to be brought back on stream. So that, you know, that reconnection of us will be really important going forward. Canada and New Zealand, you know, of course, we have we can both reaffirm and work together in working against the imposition of export controls or tariffs or non-tariff barriers that may be in place against health products, for example, essential food supplies. There's been a lot of talk, of course, through the pandemic about reshoring and becoming more self-sufficient in some of these key products. I think we think that that's something that large countries can afford to think about. It's very difficult for smaller countries like New Zealand. We can't produce some of the vital products that we need by ourselves. The supply chains for a lot of those products is hugely complex. It's more important, we believe, to reinforce an open trading system under good rules and reinforce those supply chains. And I think that's something that's a perspective that Canada shares with us, and we'll be working together on that. And as I also mentioned earlier, there's this question of the global health infrastructure, which we see as in need of overhaul in the light of COVID-19. New Zealand believes there should be a pandemic treaty, such as has been proposed by the review of the pandemic crisis, and improvements to the current institutions to make sure that they function better for members and they are better able to help members respond. So these things are really important, and I think that New Zealand and Canada will continue to have a really productive exchange around how we can help each other in each of those areas.
Indeed, High Commissioner, your point about sort of maintaining those supply chains is very vital, not only for a country like New Zealand, but also because the surrounding regions or the surrounding nations depend on New Zealand, for their supply chain, for their goods flow. And in this regard, climate change, much like COVID-19, is another such non-traditional threat that has taken the world by storm. And what would you say is the best way forward for New Zealand and Canada to address this rising security concern together, especially when it has severe consequences for the surrounding regions?
Yeah, as I said earlier, this is a key focus for us here in Ottawa, because there is a really strong relationship in the global climate change response between our two countries. Our two ministers, in fact, talk very regularly. I've participated in a number of those conversations between them, and they get down into the detail of our respective climate change policies, both domestically and internationally. So we're going to continue to make sure that our two sides keep talking and that we respond to the various areas of inquiry and interest that we have. I think New Zealand and Canada will continue to be really close partners when we're working in the international institutions to make our commitments for reduction of emissions and to respond to climate change's inevitable effects. So there's a lot that we can share. Carbon pricing is an issue that comes readily to mind, a big and important, very topical issue here in Canada, as it is in New Zealand, as we're about to start laying down our plans, our climate carbon budgets for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, where we ramp up our emissions trading system. So the price of carbon really starts to bite. So there'll be a lot where we can support each other. There are some nascent linkages between New Zealand trading system and systems in North America, like California, and in the province of Quebec. Those are going to be really important. We also have a dialogue on this about linkages between our own system and the European Union as well, as does Canada in the broad climate change area. So there's a lot that we can triangulate here in ways to help all of our countries. The development of new and clean technologies. We face very, very similar kinds of issues. high levels of renewable energy already in our economies, but really serious problems to address in terms of transport emissions across Canada, across New Zealand. So the development of the hydrogen economy is a big area of interest for us, and we're watching that closely here. We have some tie-ups already with Asian countries to see how we can work together. I mean, this may be possible with Canada in future years as well. Another important area, key area for us, and I think also an important area for Canada, is in the agricultural area. I don't know if people know, 50% of New Zealand's emissions come from agriculture, and that's just it's a feature of the dominance of agriculture in our export profile, and also the high number of animals relative to people in New Zealand. I mean, we do very well in terms of the efficiency of our production systems. We're actually low greenhouse intensity per unit of production. So our products are relatively clean by international standards, but they still make up 50% of our total emissions. So we're working really hard to get those together, working with other countries. We were a leader in setting up the Global Research Alliance on agricultural greenhouse gases, of which Canada is a member. And that's an area where I think we'd like to spend more time with Canada trying to look at the solution that we need, because there's a lot of promising stuff out there, a lot of promising technology, but commercializing these and making them cost effective is a challenge. So that's another area where I think Canada and New Zealand are going to find a lot of profitable dialogue and cooperation.
Certainly, High Commissioner. I think you put it beautifully in terms of highlighting the security threat of climate change and the importance of addressing it. And for me personally, I think it's very interesting as we consider the threat of climate change and how it relates to the international rules-based order and how we have to incorporate it into this international system where we all have to work together to address that. And on the topic of the rules-based international order, states that are reaffirming their commitment to this order must reaffirm that they're willing to stand up for multilateralism. So a question for you, High Commissioners, how can our nations grow multilateral support from our citizens to address international security concerns around the world, such as climate change, such as pandemics, and any threat against our countries?
Yeah. That's a really, really hard one. I was racking my brains for new things to do. The simple answer to this is could be summarized as hard graft. We have to do a lot more working with our partners. We have to double down a lot on our cooperation. Reinforcing every day in every way the necessity of partnerships to solve the issues we face. And our Foreign Minister, Nanaia Mahuta, has been clear that in the New Zealand context, we have a unique opportunity to ground our approach to foreign policy very much in the principles of partnership, active participation, and active protection. And in this, she means of our planet, our peoples, and our values. The foundations of New Zealand are bicultural, and increasingly these are being incorporated into the way that we go out into the world. Some of these pick up values that we've always cherished from a Western democratic perspective, but they can take on new meaning when we incorporate elements of the Māori worldview into our diplomacy. In many ways, this means when we incorporate this Māori dimension, it means that we are very much a supporter of multilateralism. It means we're very much a supporter of peaceful dispute resolution, environmental stewardship that we call kaitiakitanga, and support for universal human rights. And the last thing I'd mention is groups like yours. You have a key role to play because you're not a government organization, and you can reach parts of the population that governments sometimes will struggle to reach. We, and I think Canada too, we've been supporters of stakeholder participation in these international forums and institutions, making sure that a wide variety of voices is brought to it. Sometimes, even if these voices the governments don't necessarily agree with them, but their voices have to be heard, and they have to have an impact on the way that we solve our problems. And we think that this is really important, the stakeholder participation and voice, when there are many countries and actors right now that are trying to take us backwards in this regard.
That is indeed a very good point. So like organizations like ours, I think that's something we're always trying to learn, how we can connect the average citizen, or the average populace, to issues that might seem a world away, to grow that support. So good points all around. And speaking of the Western democratic sort of system that you spoke of, Canada and the United States are key players in the Indo-Pacific, High Commissioner. And the recent NATO summit has indicated that the rest of the alliance will also take up a larger role to play in the region. Could you speak to what this means for New Zealand in the Indo-Pacific and the role of the alliance in sort of ensuring peace and security?
I guess, prior to COVID-19, the geopolitical outlook was already shifting, indicating that we were heading towards a world that was becoming less open and less secure. In many respects, COVID-19 has just sort of amplified the fact that we live in an age of uncertainty and greater risk. Our global recovery is now taking place in that context of, I think you'd say, deteriorating stability and security. So we have to learn to adjust our foreign policy as we determine new directions, and as we respond to some of these aggravated security risks, including transnational crime, cyber threats, potential conflict, areas of conflicts in parts of the world. And so for us, this means that we really have to build more into our security partnerships, including, as I've said, with NATO and its focus on our part of the world. So we encourage that because its experience and the wealth of sort of intellectual power that those nations can bring to our region, will help us to determine the best solutions in the Indo-Pacific region as well. Our relationships with Australia, with the US, with the EU, the UK, Canada, Korea, I mean, these are really important in helping us to address some of these threats. I hope that answers your question. It's not very specific, but that's it.
No, it really does answer the question. It actually leads really well into our final question for this moderated period. So at this time, I remind the audience that to keep getting those live audience questions in, and we'll get to as many as we can, as we already have a number of really excellent questions. So for a final moderated question for you, High Commissioner, and it's really important that within the Indo-Pacific, we do address the rise of China and China's role within the Indo-Pacific. And how does New Zealand see the rise of China, and how is that shaping New Zealand's response to managing its relationship with China?
Yeah, thank you very much. And, given the nature of the seminar, I can really only echo what has been said by our ministers. So apologies to some if I'm repeating what they might have read already about New Zealand's response. First of all, as our ministers have said, China's geostrategic relevance is a reality, and no country can ignore. And we need to have a good relationship with China. We've always sought to develop that relationship with China, and we'll continue to be engaged with China. We don't believe there's any choice in that respect. And second, there will be opportunities for New Zealand and China to work together, particularly in international trade. We have a very strong trade and relationship, but also trading framework an agreement with China that's brought benefits to both countries. We believe that as long as we're trading with China, the best thing is to have the best agreement with China. China will hold us to our commitments, and we will hold China to its commitments. There'll be a chance for us also to work, I think, as many countries recognize, in areas like environment and climate change. China's response to climate change is perhaps the key response that's needed globally, and also the pandemic and the threats of future pandemics. And the third point I make, and ministers have made this point, different perspectives can underpin cultural exchanges and learning. And so that, there will always, we have a large Chinese, ethnic Chinese community in New Zealand. We have strong ties between all kinds of people, both ways, and these will endure, and we should always try to make the best of those linkages. But there are going to be some differences with China that challenge New Zealand's interests and values. And managing our relationship is not always going to be easy, given our two countries' different histories, worldviews, political and legal systems. New Zealand and China are going to take some different perspectives on issues. What's key for us, we believe, in our relationship with China is that we do that consistently, we do that transparently. We don't spring surprises on our partner, and we consistently say to China on areas where we disagree, well, this should be as no surprise. These are the values that we hold dear, and we'll continue to express those values. And we've shown this clearly over the last year or so, deliberately choosing when to make public statements on issues of concern and with whom. Because we as New Zealanders, we will take principled stances on issues, particularly where our values are at stake. What can I say? I guess we would say finally that the areas of difference need not define a relationship. But equally, there are interests and values at play here in our relationship with China that are becoming harder to reconcile. And this is a challenge that we and many other countries across the Indo-Pacific also face, but also countries in Europe as well. We do pay close attention to the way that China treats its partners, those partners who are friends, trusted partners for us, and we'll continue to promote the things that we believe in, support of the rules-based system that underpins our collective well-being.
Indeed, High Commissioner, given China's, as you mentioned, sort of key role in the Indo-Pacific, an honest, balanced strategy is vital to the region. And in the interest of time, I believe we have to bring our moderated discussion to a close. So thank you so much for your inputs and insights. And we will now be opening the floor to questions from our live audience. And we already have some great questions coming in. With that, the first question that I have for you is to do with the fact that New Zealand has been observed as one of the most exemplary former British dominions in matters of Indigenous reconciliation, with the Maori specifically. What do you think Canada can learn from New Zealand here, especially given how we here in Canada are learning and healing from our past?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a really, really good question. Yeah, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, New Zealand has done really well in this respect," but comparisons are invidious in some respect, because New Zealand's history is a colonial history. It is a history of the imposition of a dominant culture upon another culture. It's had very sad effects in many areas. It was marked by a treaty in the very early days of settlement that was honoured in the breach very much until comparatively recently. But I guess the thing that has marked New Zealand in recent decades is its ability to build on those, I guess, the good things that we have to be able to bring cultures back together and reconcile each other, ourselves to each other, if I might put it that way, and to resolve grievances. So the Treaty of Waitangi of 1840 was for a long time seen as a fraud by many Māori. Now it's integrated into the constitutional structure because through a process of political activism and judicial activism on the part of Māori, eventually the partnership that's implicit in this treaty was brought into mainstream legal and political thinking. So now every law needs to be consistent with the partnership that's embodied in the Treaty of Waitangi. And that treaty and the setting up of a commission, which was there to investigate and give recommendations on the grievances brought by the Māori tribes before it, that has enabled in a program manner over many years the resolution of a lot of the grievances, although there are still significant ones that remain outstanding. I mean, New Zealand has also benefited, I think, from political reform. I think it's fair to say that our proportional representation system of government has enabled more, not just Māori people, but Pacifica and also people of other ethnic backgrounds to be brought into the mainstream political process and for people to feel that more of their own number are represented in the political system. So there are a number of things. I think there are, I won't pinpoint them, but I think there are a lot of areas of this experience that will be of help or would be of help to Indigenous groups in Canada as they also seek to find redress for past wrongs and to and encourage the rest of Canada, into a process of real and effective reconciliation. And we're trying to do some things with Canada on that. Where I think there's always learning in both directions. So at the moment we have in train an Indigenous cooperation agreement at a government-to-government level, but hopefully driven very much by the wishes of Indigenous people on the kinds of subjects that we should be interacting on, learning from, etc. Reconciliation, treaty settlement processes, these could be some of the elements that are drawn into such a framework and the work program that would be built into it. The trade and economic sphere is another area where I think New Zealand tribal groups and authorities have a lot to offer, where they've been quite active, are already in contact with a lot of people in Indigenous peoples in Canada, and there's a lot more that we can build. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, for us in the High Commission, this is a very exciting prospect to have this agreement potentially signed later this year and hopefully brought into practice as quickly as possible.
Very true, High Commissioner. I think it's really important that us as countries, in terms of Canada and New Zealand, we work internationally together to address these Indigenous issues, but we also put Indigenous peoples at the forefront to lead these conversations, as they are the people that know best in terms of how to reconcile and how to truly make a difference in the communities. Moving on to the next question, where it's more of a question about free movement and free trade. And our audience member asks, what is New Zealand's position on the prospect of free movement and free trade between Canada, the UK, and Australia, aka CANZUK, akin to the Trans-Tasman Agreement with Australia?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked about quite a lot here in Canada. The first step that we're taking is is under the auspices of the CPTPP, right? So we already have one of the highest quality free trade agreements between us, between countries of the Asia Pacific region. Sadly, not with the US yet, but it was an agreement that was designed to bring other countries in and to build its breadth as well as its depth over time. And we now have a process for bringing the UK within that agreement. So when the UK, I imagine, successfully negotiates its accession to CPTPP, we will have a free trade agreement that encompasses Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, but also the other countries of CPTPP. The question with regard to CANZUK is what is the add-on there? That what could we do on a trilateral base? So it's a quadrilateral basis, isn't it? Including Australia, that we don't already have. And I think the key answer there is around the movement of people, as you mentioned. Free trade agreements always try to facilitate the movement of people around in the business dimension, so that we can facilitate trade and investment, and ensure that the right people are able to travel and do business, set up businesses, be managers, be technical specialists, and so that mode 4 services, as we call it, is really important in any free trade agreement. So there are things that we could do within the CPTPP context as well between us, which could facilitate that kind of movement. If you're moving into the realm of something bigger, like a trans-Tasman travel arrangement, such as we have with Australia, whereby we have access to each other's labour markets, then that will start to, I think, to bring in a whole lot of many more difficult questions that we would have to resolve. I mean, first and foremost is the non-discriminatory aspects of modern immigration policy. So we would be, in effect, actively discriminating in favour of Canadians, in New Zealand's case, British, in addition to Australian. The Australian arrangement for us is a unique arrangement, but that's very much embedded in our history and our what is more or less a single economic market between us. To do that more broadly with Canada, the UK, I think poses some pretty significant political issues, and how aligned are we going to be? How more aligned are we going to be in questions of business and regulation, long-term immigration policy? But you still have to, I think, get over that initial question. How do we sustain politically what would be a discriminatory set of immigration policies towards a small group of admittedly like-minded countries, but just a small grouping.
Indeed, High Commissioner, that is a very good point. As much as we all see the merits of multilateralism and sort of the movements of peoples, if they're between certain groups, that does give rise to certain political challenges, which one must keep in mind. And we also have another question. The next question is about sort of New Zealand's changing perspectives. So Canada's attention is slowly turning to the Arctic, where competition is assumed to increase as ice melts. New Zealand, on the other hand, is on the other end of the world and is in the Antarctic region. Do you foresee the Antarctic as a theatre for strategic competition between the US and China or other powers?
I think it's fair to say, it's a fair assumption that it already is. It's different in respect of the fact that it's governed by a very different treaty arrangement. It's a landmass, as well as a region, and is subject to competing historical land claims, territorial claims, but I think for different regions, it is already subject, I think, to a certain degree of rivalry. and there's some very key challenges there that we're needing to face up to. I mean, New Zealand very much is in the camp of wanting to preserve the Antarctic, as heritage of mankind, and keep it free from strategic rivalries and competition, preserve an environment which is unique and fragile, and we will resist the temptation of countries to wish to exploit it for economic advantage. But we're seeing some of the rivalries around this already playing out, in particular around the southern oceans, which have been subject to a lot of illegal fishing and other marine activity, and increasingly this is difficult to counter. So we are relying on our partnerships with many countries to try and ensure that this is, again, it's part of the rules-based order, and the activity that takes place there is subject to agreed rules and practices. And what we have under the Antarctic Treaty arrangements and the what's known as the CAMLA provisions on Antarctic marine living resources, those have to be preserved and strengthened, working with partners like Canada, for example.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. And I think that is a wonderful note to sort of end our audience questions off. And it's really important that as we sort of look towards the next sort of regions of security, we're always considering the Arctic, we're always considering the Antarctic, and we're always looking for ways to cooperate more. So thank you so much for every single answer you've given today with our moderated questions, as well as our live audience. And we really do appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to come speak to us today. And with that, Lana, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up the event.
Thank you, Eric. High Commissioner Harvey, thank you for your opening presentation. Eric and Adwit, as always, for guiding us through such an interesting and timely discussion. I have one last quick question for our esteemed guest, and if I may, I will take it to a bit of a lighter note than the important topics that you all have been discussing. I was hoping to ask a question about your Prime Minister and engage our younger audiences now watching on YouTube. With her coming into her role, I think she took the world a little bit by storm. There are so many memes and GIFs, and her quotes are all over social media. And I believe in many respects, her face has become maybe a token of true change where women leadership in the defense roles are concerned. Here in Canada, we often have the question and the discussion about how it is predominantly a male-dominated role to be in the public service careers. And in the last years, the question of diversity is one that has become at the very heart for NATO and many leading countries in the world. And so my question to you, sir, is being a careered politician and being in the service for so many years, would you maybe have a story or a way that you have noticed that New Zealand has changed with your Prime Minister coming into power, or perhaps how you have noticed a shift in the way New Zealand is treated by other world leaders and otherwise? Just an interesting way to wrap up the discussion. Thank you.
Well, it just readily springs to mind because, for the first time, I think in my career representing New Zealand overseas, when I say where I'm from and who I represent, people say, "Oh, you have such a fantastic Prime Minister," rather than talking about the All Blacks or the number of sheep. So I'm just truly grateful as a diplomat that we're talking about political leadership as something that in New Zealand that's being admired globally. And I have to mention, of course, we have an Indigenous Foreign Minister. Minister Nanaia Mahuta is New Zealand's first woman, but also Indigenous woman Foreign Minister, Māori woman Foreign Minister, and she's bringing a whole new perspective to the way that that we look at ourselves and look at the way that we project ourselves in the world. But it's just great to have Canadians coming up to me and saying, we love your Prime Minister. I mean, she is I think something special with regard to leadership, and she's shown that in times of great crisis, which I think is the mark of any true leader.
Thank you, High Commissioner. She truly is a trailblazer, and I think we in Canada and in many countries around the world are very grateful for her and for all of your leadership in New Zealand. So thank you very much. What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you again to our guests and our moderators for this discussion. We invite our audience to stay engaged and to subscribe to our channel on YouTube and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and to make sure you don't miss any of our future events. We encourage you all to stay tuned for our next essential conversation about Canada's peace and security. And thank you all very much for joining us today.